Permatasari, and in here I want to retell a novel. The title is Pride and Prejudice. This novel, that written by Jane Austen, tells about 5 sisters from a family and how they deal with issues of marriage, morality, misconceptions of women's status in society at the moment. The central theme to Pride and Prejudice is romantic comedy with slice of life. The novel especially focuses on the different ways in which love grows between gentlemen and ordinary girls, and whether there is room for romantic love and married life in society. The story centers on the Bennet family, particularly Elizabeth. The novels open at Longbourn, the Bennet family's estate. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 children: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Bennet first met Mr. Bingley and his companions at Meryton Ball. The townspeople conclude that Mr. Bingley is perfectly amiable and agreeable. Meanwhile, Mr. Bingley takes an immediate liking to Jane Bennet. Mr. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, however, snubs Elizabeth. The community decides that Darcy is proud and disagreeable because of his reserves and his refusal to dance. Jane finds Bingley's sister, Caroline and Mrs. Hurst, to be amiable, but Elizabeth sees them as arrogant. Jane and Bingley are interested in one another. However, while Bingley makes his partiality quite obvious, Jane is cheerful and shy. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, has a very pragmatic view of marriage. Mr. Darcy begins to admire Elizabeth, captivated by her fine eyes and lively wit. She, however, remains contemptuous toward him. When Jane is invited for dinner at Netherfield, Mr. Bennet refuses to provide her with a carriage, hoping that impending rainstorm will force her to spend the night there. After getting caught in the rain, Jane actually falls ill and has to remain at Netherfield for many days. Upon hearing that Jane is ill, Elizabeth walks to Bingley's estate through the muddy field. Elizabeth continues to impress Mr. Darcy during her time nursing Jane at Netherfield. However, she remains blind to his affections and continues to see him as a proud and haughty man. Mrs. Bennet and her younger daughters come to Netherfield to check on Jane and Elizabeth, mortified by their foolish behavior and complete lack of manner. After Jane recovers, she returns home with Elizabeth. One day, Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's distant cousin, will write a letter stating his intention to visit. Mr. Collins hopes to make amends for the entanglement by marrying one of Mr. Bennet's daughters. Mr. Collins proves himself to be a silly man, speaking in the long, pompous speeches with an air of solemn formality. Elizabeth and Mr. Collins then go for a walk, and on the way they meet an officer in the regiment named Wickham. They also run into Mr. Darcy. When Mr. Darcy and Wickham see another, both men become visibly uncomfortable. Wickham shows that an immediate partiality for Elizabeth, and they speak at length over the following days. Wickham explained his past with Darcy. Darcy's either had promised that Wickham, his godsons, would inherit the good living after the elder man's death. Elizabeth, already predisposed to think badly of Darcy. When Elizabeth tells Wickham's story to Jane, However, Jane refused to think badly of either Wickham or Darcy, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding. Bingley hosts a ball at Netherfield. Bingley and Jane spend the whole evening together. However, Mrs. Bennet speaks loudly about their engagement, and Elizabeth notes that Darcy overhears her. Later that evening, Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance and she accepts him, but she doesn't enjoy it and cannot understand why he asks her. Mr. Collins pays particularly close attention to Elizabeth at the ball and even reserves the first to dance with her. The next day, Mr. Collins proposed to Elizabeth, but she refused him. Mr. Bennet is extremely angry at Elizabeth for refusing Mr. Collins, but Mr. Bennet is glad that Mr. Collins quickly shifted his attention to Charlotte Lucas, who is Elizabeth's best friend. And then Elizabeth is disappointed to her friend for agreeing to marry such a silly man like Mr. Collins. Bingley travels to London for business, but plans to return to Netherfield. His sister and Darcy soon follow him. Soon thereafter, Caroline writes to Jane to say that Bingley has changed his plans and will not return to Netherfield for 6 months. Caroline also informs Jane that she hopes Bingley will marry Darcy's younger sister in order to unite two families' fortunes. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, who is Elizabeth's aunt and uncle, come to Longbourn to visit. They hear that Jane is sad and then invite her to stay with them in London for a while. Elizabeth hopes that Jane will run into Bingley while she is in London. While Jane in London, Caroline Bingley is extremely rude to her. Jane assumes that Mr. Bingley knows that she is in London, and since he doesn't call, she decides he is no longer cares for her. On the spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte, her friend who married to Mr. Collins. They live near Mr. Collins' patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Darcy's aunt, and Mr. Darcy then meets Elizabeth. One day he made a shocking proposal and Elizabeth quickly refused. She told that Mr. Darcy was arrogant and rude. Then she scolded him. She told that Bingley to leave Jane and deprive Wickham of his inheritance. Mr. Darcy left her but wrote her a letter shortly thereafter. In that letter, he admitted that he agreed Bingley to distance himself from Jane but claimed that he did it so because he thought that their relationship was not serious. As for Wickham, he informs Elizabeth that the younger officer is a liar and that the real cause of their disagreement was Wickham's attempt to elope with his younger sister, Georgiana Darcy. The message made Elizabeth reset her feelings for Mr. Darcy. With the arrival of Jane, Elizabeth embarked on another journey, this time with Gardiner's family, a relative of the Bennet. The trip takes her to the north and eventually to the neighborhood of Pemberley, Darcy's estate. She visits Pemberley after making sure that Darcy is away, and delights in the building and ground. While hearing from Darcy's servants that he is a wonderful, generous master, suddenly Darcy arrives and behaves cordially toward her. But he is making a mention of his proposal before, and then he entertains the Cardinals and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. And then Elizabeth returned home and treat Wickham coldly, fearing that this situation would bring shame to her and her family. Elizabeth hurried home, and Mr. Cardinal set off to find Lydia, but Mr. Bennet eventually returned home with empty hands. Just when all hope seemed to disappear, a letter from Mr. Cardinal stated that the couple had been discovered and Wickham agreed to marry Lydia in exchange to annual income. The Bennets are convinced that Mr. Cardinal has paid off Wickham, but Elizabeth learns that the source of the money and of her family's salvation was none other than Darcy. Now married, Wickham and Lydia briefly return to Longbourn, and Mr. Bennet treated them indifferently. Then they set off to Wickham in the north of England for a new mission. Soon thereafter, Bingley returned to Netherfield and resumed his courtship of Jane. Darcy lived with him and visited Bennet, but did not mention her to his wish to marry Elizabeth. On the other hand, Bingley pressed his clothes and proposed to Jane, except for Bingley's broad sister. While the family was celebrating, Lady Catherine de Bourgh visited Longbourn. She turned to Elizabeth and said that she had heard that her nephew, Darcy, was planning to marry her. Since she considers Bennet an unsuitable match for Darcy, Lady Catherine demands that Elizabeth promise to refuse him. Elizabeth spiritlessly refuses and saying she is not engaged to Darcy, but she will not promise anything against her own happiness. A little later, Elizabeth and Darcy go out walking together, and he tells her that his feelings have not altered since the spring. She tenderly accepts his proposal, and both Jane and Elizabeth are married by their couple. I think that's enough from me. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry if I have many mistakes on my speaks. And see you. Have a nice day.